The air tasted of ash and kerosene when Brian Clark felt something impossible press against his right shoulder, force so physical, so deliberate, that his entire body pivoted left as if caught in invisible hands. Smoke churned through the stairwell of the South Tower like angry ghosts. And somewhere below him, past the rubble and the darkness and the screaming metal, a voice called out with the desperation of a man who knew he was about to die. Brian stood frozen on the 81st floor landing, his fire marshal's flashlight cutting a thin blade of hope through the chaos. And in that moment, he made a choice that would alter to lives forever. The others in his group were already turning back, heading upward, toward the roof, where they believed helicopters would come. But Brian's feet felt glued to the concrete, his heart hammering with a certainty he couldn't name. This was September 11, 2001, and every second was a countdown to eternity. Before the world shattered, Brian Clark's mornings followed a rhythm as predictable as a metronome alarm at 5:30. Shower and shave, a bowl of cereal eaten in the pre-dawn quiet of his New Jersey home, and out the door by 6:15 to catch the train into Manhattan. He was an executive vice president at Eurobrokers, a man who loved the electric pulse of the trading floor where voices shouted interest rates across the room and $50 million deals closed with a yell and a handshake. His office sat on the 84th floor of 2 World Trade Center, so high that on clear days he could see the curve of the Earth meeting the Atlantic, a view that never failed to make him feel both insignificant and blessed. He was 50 years old, an only child raised in Canada, a man of steady faith who attended church on Sundays and believed in the quiet workings of Providence without needing to shout about it. That Tuesday morning, as he sat at his keyboard, typing emails in the golden light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, Brian had no idea he was about to step into the most profound spiritual experience of his life. At 8:46 a.m., the lights above Brian's desk buzzed and flickered, and his head jerked up as a sound like thunder rolled through the building. The North Tower had been struck by American Airlines Flight 11. Though no one yet understood what was happening, Brian called his wife to tell her he was fine, that it was the other tower, that everything would be okay. And the PA system crackled to life with reassuring words. Building 2 is secure. Employees who had started evacuating were told they could return to their floors, that the danger was isolated, that there was no need for panic in the South Tower. Brian and his colleagues lingered by their desks, uncertain, watching smoke billow from their sister tower across the sky, a sight so surreal it seemed like a movie projection against the morning blue. Then, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 tore into the South Tower between floors 77 and 80, and Brian's world exploded in a double boom that felt like the hand of God slamming a door. For 10 seconds only, Brian knew terror, so pure it erased thought, as the building swayed and he wondered if it would topple like a felled tree. But then the swaying stopped, and a voice inside him whispered with impossible calm, "You're going to be okay." Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Brian gathered 8 surviving co-workers from his floor, and they started down stairwell at DO1 furthest from his office, the one he rarely used, chosen not by logic but by an instinct he couldn't explain. They made it only 3 floors before they encountered a woman and a man coming up the stairs, faces streaked with soot, the woman blocking their path with wild eyes that held both fear and conviction. She told them the stairs below were impassable, filled with flames and smoke, that their only hope was to go up to the roof, where helicopters would surely come to lift them to safety. Brian and his group stopped on the landing and began to debate, voices rising in the acrid air, some wanting to trust the woman's warning, others insisting they should continue down into the unknown darkness. It was a moment of terrible mathematics, or down, life or death, trust or doubt. Brian felt the weight of his role as fire marshal pressing on him like a physical burden. He opened his mouth to speak, to lead, to decide, but then he heard it, a voice crying out from somewhere in the smoke. Faint but desperate, calling for help with the urgency of a drowning man. The words were simple. "Help. I'm buried. Is anyone there? I can't breathe. But they landed on Brian's heart like a command from somewhere beyond himself. The debate continued around him. But Brian's attention had split, pulled like iron filings to a magnet toward that distant cry for help. His co-worker Ron DeFrancesco turned to him, gesturing toward the voice. And together they moved away from the group, picking their way through debris toward the sound of suffering. Ron made it only halfway before the smoke overwhelmed him and he staggered back to the stairwell. But Brian pressed forward, his flashlight beam dancing across shattered walls and twisted metal, his lungs somehow drawing clean air when there should have been none. Later, he would describe it as a bubble of protective oxygen around his head, as if an invisible hand cupped his face and filtered the poison, letting him breathe when breathing should have been impossible. He called out into the darkness, his voice hoarse, and the answering cry grew louder. More frantic, a man's voice edged with desperation and hope. Brian followed it like a thread through a labyrinth, climbing over fallen ceiling tiles and wading through ankle-deep debris, until he saw it a hand, waving through a hole in a standing wall, fingers splayed in desperate beckoning. The hand belonged to Stanley Prameneth, a man Brian had never met. A stranger who was about to become a brother. Stanley had seen the plane coming. He had been on the phone in his 81st floor office at Fuji Bank when he looked up and locked eyes with the approaching aircraft. A moment of pure horror frozen in time like a photograph. He dove beneath his desk an instant before United Flight 175 crashed through his office. The left wing slicing through the space where he'd been standing and lodging in a doorframe 20 feet away, the impact collapsing walls and ceiling around him like a house of cards. His desk's solid wood, unmovable, had stood firm while everything else shattered, and Stanley found himself buried in rubble, bruised and bleeding, surrounded by flames and the terrible groaning of a wounded building. He was trapped behind a 10-foot drywall partition that had somehow remained standing. A barrier between him and escape, between him and death, between him and the man with the flashlight, who was now shouting encouragement through the smoke. Stanley's entire body was swollen and black with bruises, his mind reeling with the certainty that he was about to die, that the floor above would collapse and crush him, that the fire would consume him, that he would suffocate in the dust and darkness. But then he heard Brian's voice, telling him to punch through the wall, to climb, to not give up, and something in Stanley, some wellspring of faith or fury or desperate will, found the carry strength to move. Stanley's fists hammered against the drywall. Once, twice, 3 times, each blow weakening the barrier until his hands burst through and he began tearing at the opening with bleeding fingers. Brian reached through from the other side, grabbing Stanley's arms, pulling with all his strength while Stanley pushed with his feet against the rubble behind him, a terrible birth through destruction, until finally Stanley tumbled through the gap and collapsed into Brian's arms. The 2 men fell together in a heap, gasping, and Brian looked at this stranger, this bleeding, dust-covered man whose name he didn't know, and felt something shift in his soul, a recognition that transcended circumstance. Stanley tried to thank him, reaching up to embrace him. But Brian took his hand and held it gently, examining the lacerations, the blood that welled from cuts on both their palms. Brian looked Stanley in the eyes and spoke words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind. All my life I was an only child. I always wanted a brother. I found one today. Then he did something that would seal their bond forever. He took Stanley's bleeding hand and rubbed it against his own, mingling their blood, marking them as kin. "You're my blood brother," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't fully understand. "Come on, buddy, let's go home." Together, they made their way back to the stairwell. 2 men bound by trauma and providence, and found the landing empty. Brian's original group had departed, heading up toward the roof where they believed salvation waited, a decision that would cost them all their lives. Brian and Stanley started down through Stairwell A, the only passable route, though they didn't know it at the time, navigating through smoke and debris that seemed to part for them like a biblical sea. They encountered wounded people on their descent, a man with a broken back and massive head, injuries begging them to tell his wife and new baby he loved them. a security guard named Jose Marrero watching over another injured person. At each encounter they paused, called 911 on behalf of those who couldn't move, left them with promises that help was coming, though both men knew time was running out. The stairs seemed endless, floor after floor of darkness, punctuated by emergency lighting, their footsteps echoing in the concrete shaft while the building groaned and shuddered around them. Stanley's one remaining shoother, other lost somewhere in the rubble of his office, clacked against each step, glass shards embedded in its rubber sole catching the dim light, a metronome marking their progress toward life. They talked little, conserving breath and energy, but a bond was forming between them that would outlast steel and concrete, a friendship forged in fire and sealed by something neither man could name, but both believed was divine. At 9:56 a.m., exactly 4 minutes before the South Tower would collapse, Brian Clark and Stanley Pramnath burst through the lobby doors onto Liberty Street, blinking in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of their descent. A rescue worker shouted at them to run, and they did, sprinting away from the building through streets littered with debris and paper, not stopping until they'd covered 2 blocks and stood panting in the shadow of other buildings. Stanley turned to look back at the tower they'd just escaped, its upper floors wreathed in black smoke, and spoke words that seemed to come from some prophetic place. "I think that building's going to come down." Brian, still processing their survival, still clinging to the solidity of the world he'd known that morning, shook his head and began to argue these were steel structures, built to withstand anything. Surely they would burn but not fall. He didn't finish his sentence. The South Tower began to collapse, one floor pancaking onto another with a sound like continuous thunder. 110 stories, dissolving in less than 10 seconds, taking with it everyone who had gone up instead of down, everyone who had ignored the cry for help, everyone who had made a different choice. Brian and Stanley stood frozen, watching the impossible, as a tsunami of dust and debris rolled toward them like a living thing. They ran again, disappearing into the cloud, separated in the chaos, Stanley eventually finding a truck driver who gave him a ride to the Brooklyn Bridge while Brian made his way home to New Jersey, both men unsure if the other had survived. That evening, after midnight, after Stanley had finally made it home from the hospital where they'd treated his wounds, he called the number on the business card they'd exchanged in the lobby of 42 Broadway just before the North Tower fell. Brian answered, and to strangers who had become brothers, confirmed that they were both, impossibly, alive. In the days and weeks that followed, as the world tried to make sense of the senseless, as rescue became recovery, became mourning, Brian Clark and Stanley Pramnath began to understand the magnitude of what had happened between them. Only 18 people survived from at or above the impact zone of United Flight 175. 18 souls out of hundreds who were trapped in those upper floors, and Brian and Stanley were 2 of them, their survival linked by a series of choices and circumstances that seemed to defy probability. Brian's original group, the 7 co-workers who had gone up the stairs, toward the roof, all perished when access doors to the top proved locked and helicopters never came through smoke too dense for safe approach. Ron DeFrancesco, who had turned back from helping Stanley due to smoke inhalation, found the strength to reverse course and descend the stairs, becoming the last person to exit the South Tower before its collapse, waking days later in a hospital with severe burns and memory loss. 61 of Brian's Eurobrokers colleagues died that day, including friends he'd worked beside for years, people whose desks were just feet from his own. The randomness of survival haunted him. Why these people, and not those? Why Stanley's desk stood firm when everything around it collapsed? Why he felt that impossible push on his shoulder, directing him to the only usable stairwell? Why he heard Stanley's cry through the roar of chaos when others didn't? Stanley grappled with similar questions, remembering how he'd initially evacuated after the first plane hit, but returned to his office when security guards announced the South Tower was secure, a decision that nearly cost him his life. Both men were left with survivor's guilt that mixed with overwhelming gratitude, a complicated emotional cocktail that would take years to process and never fully resolve. The flashlight that Brian used to find Stanley a simple fire. Martial's tool that had guided them through the darkness became a symbol of their shared journey. And Brian eventually donated it to the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, where it sits today as a testament to providence and choice. Stanley invited Brian to speak at his church on the first anniversary of the attacks, beginning a pattern that would define both their lives in the years to come. They traveled together, appeared on documentaries for NBC, CNN, the History Channel, BBC, PBS, telling their story hundreds of times to churches, schools, charity groups, anyone who would listen, because they both felt an obligation to honor those who didn't make it out by living purposeful lives that mattered. Brian retired from finance and devoted himself to helping children and non-profit work, serving on boards and volunteering with organizations that aided the families of 9/11's victims. Stanley, whose faith had been strong before that day, found it transformed into something fiercer and more evangelical, eventually becoming certified as an assistant pastor at Bethel Assembly of God in Queens, believing that God had spared him for a purpose he was obligated to fulfill. They called each other every few months, these two men who had been strangers until that terrible Tuesday, and spoke of ordinary things, family, work, weather, and of the extraordinary bond that held them together. A connection that transcended circumstance and dwelt in the realm of the spiritual. Stanley kept that one surviving shoe in a box labeled Deliverance in his home, a physical reminder of the miracle he'd lived through. Brian kept Stanley's business card in his wallet 22 years later, a talisman that grounded him when memories threatened to overwhelm. Both men credit each other with saving their life, a paradox they're content to hold in tension without needing to resolve. Stanley says that without Brian's flashlight and courage, he would have died behind that wall, suffocated or crushed or consumed by fire. Brian counters that without hearing Stanley's cry, he would have stayed with his group and gone up the stairs to the locked roof, perishing with everyone else who made that fateful choice. Each claims the other as savior, and perhaps the truth is that they saved each other, that their survival was a joint venture between human action and divine orchestration, free will and providence dancing together in those smoke-filled stairwells. Brian describes feeling an inexplicable push on his shoulder, a guidance that felt physical but came from no human hand, and a bubble of breathable air that surrounded his head when he should have been choking. Stanley speaks of his desk standing firm amid total destruction, of having the strength to punch through drywall when his body was broken and exhausted, of the Bible he'd kept on his desk that somehow survived the impact. Both men use the language of miracle and divine intervention, not as religious platitudes, but as the only framework they have for experiences that defy natural explanation. They do not claim to know why they were spared when so many others were not. Do not pretend to understand God's calculus in choosing who lives and who dies in moments of mass tragedy. They have learned, as Brian puts it, that there's no point in wasting time trying to answer unanswerable questions about the past, or worrying about unpredictable futures, which leaves only the present moment, and that's where they've chosen to live. Over the years, they've shared platforms and pulpits, television studios and memorial services, their story becoming a modern parable about faith, courage, and the split-second decisions that define existence. Mark Ashton, pastor of Christ Community Church in Omaha, said his congregation was on the edge of their seats, tears streaming down faces, spines chilled with the proximity of death and the miracle of survival, when Brian spoke at their church. Journalists and documentary makers have chronicled their story repeatedly, drawn by the compelling narrative of two strangers becoming brothers, of last-minute rescues and impossible escapes, of faith tested and proven in fire. Yet what makes their testimony powerful is not the drama, though it has that in abundance, but the humility with which they tell it. They don't claim special righteousness or divine favor that others lacked. They don't know why they lived and their neighbors died in the same building, on the same floors, in the same moments. What they offer instead is a witness to something beyond themselves, a testimony that in humanity's darkest moments, when buildings fall and thousands perish and the world seems to have cracked open to reveal only chaos and meaningless suffering, There are still thin places where the divine breaks through. They speak of hearing voices, Brian, the inexplicable guidance that pushed him toward the only passable stairwell. Stanley, the sense that he had to crawl toward the darting flashlight, or Diane. They both frame these as answered prayers, though neither recalls consciously praying in those moments. Perhaps that's the point. That prayer in extremis is less about words than about the soul's raw cry for help, about the instinctive reach towards something greater than self when self proves insufficient. Brian and Stanley's friendship has endured long past the initial trauma, evolving from survivor bond to genuine brotherhood. They've attended each other's family weddings, called to check in during hard times, shared meals and memories, and the comfortable silence of people who understand each other at a level words can't reach. When Stanley got married after the attacks, Brian was there. When Brian's daughter got married, Stanley stood among the guests. They are, as they've said repeatedly, blood brothers, bound not just by shared experience but by a covenant made in that moment when Brian rubbed their wounds together and claimed Stanley as kin. It's a relationship that defies the modern tendency to let friendships fade with time and distance. Maintained, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and the recognition that what happened to them on September 11, 2001, transformed them both in ways that require continuing witness. They are living testaments to each other's survival, proof that the story was real. That grace sometimes wears the face of a stranger with a flashlight. That miracles can look like making it down 81 flights of stairs just minutes before everything collapses. Their lives since that day have been dedicated to honoring the dead by living fully, by choosing purpose over despair, by letting their impossible survival become a source of hope rather than guilt. They speak at events for severely abused children, at churches grappling with tragedy, at schools teaching the history of that terrible day, and everywhere they go, they carry the same message, that life is precious, that time shouldn't be wasted, that we never know when a split-second decision might alter everything. That faith sometimes manifests as an inexplicable push on the shoulder or a voice crying out in the smoke. The story of Brian Clark and Stanley Premnath is not ultimately about buildings or planes or terrorism. Though those elements frame it, it's about two human beings faced with impossible choices who chose to move toward each other rather than away, who heard need and responded even when response seemed foolish, who trusted instincts that felt divine even when logic suggested different paths. It's about the mystery of survival in the face of mass death, about finding brotherhood in catastrophe, about the way suffering can crack open the human heart to reveal unexpected depths of courage and connection. It asks us to consider what we would do if we heard a cry for help while everyone else was running away. Whether we would follow the inexplicable push on our shoulder or ignore it in favor of the crowd's direction. How we interpret the moments when everything we know dissolves and we're left with nothing but instinct and faith. Their story offers no easy answers about why bad things happen to good people, why some survive and others don't, whether God intervenes in human affairs or simply sustains us through whatever comes. What it offers instead is a testimony that sometimes, in the midst of the worst that humanity can do to itself, there are moments of grace so profound they can only be called miraculous. A flashlight's beam cutting through smoke, a desk that stands firm when everything falls, a voice that won't give up calling for help, a stranger who becomes a brother, and the split-second choice to move towards suffering instead of away from it. This account draws from documented XLO survivor testimony preserved by CNN, BBC News, the History Channel, National Geographic, Fox News, and the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, where Brian Clark's fire marshal flashlight resides today as a symbol of faith and survival. The rescue of Stanley Premnath by Brian Clark on the 80th floor of the South Tower remains one of the most extraordinary stories of September 11, 2001, a day that took nearly 3,000 lives but left these two men and 16 others from the impact zone to witness that even in humanity's darkest hour, hope persists and miracles happen. Brian and Stanley have never wavered in crediting divine guidance for their survival. believing that what happened between them was orchestrated by something greater than chance. A conviction they've shared in hundreds of speaking engagements across 2 decades. Their story stands as testament that faith, in its purest form, is the courage to follow an inexplicable push on the shoulder, to answer a cry for help when everyone else says run, and to recognize that sometimes the voice of God sounds like a stranger calling out from behind a wall, asking if anyone is there.